The bullet had been in Robert Atkins for 3 days before he finally admitted to himself that he was dying. And the strangest part of it all was that he felt more at peace with that fact than he had felt about anything else in the 32 years he had spent walking this earth. He had boarded the westbound Union Pacific train at Cheyenne, Wyoming, in the early autumn of 1878, pressing a folded cloth against the wound in his side with one hand and gripping the iron railing of the passenger car with the other. The conductor had given him a long, suspicious look, the kind of look men in his profession learned to recognize before their hands even moved toward their guns. But Robert had just smiled, slow and easy, and paid for his ticket with coins that clinked clean and honest in the man's palm. And the conductor had decided that whatever trouble this lean, dark-eyed stranger carried with him was not worth the argument. He found a seat near the back of the car, away from the families with their bundled children and their baskets of food, away from the cattlemen and their wide hats who spoke too loudly about cattle prices and land disputes. He pressed himself into the corner against the window and watched the great brown flatness of Wyoming begin to roll past as the train gathered speed, and he breathed carefully, because breathing too deeply pulled at the wound in a way that made the edges of his vision go white. He had not expected company. The woman sat down across from him at the small junction town of Laramie, when the train stopped to take on water and coal, and let off a handful of passengers who had clearly made a mistake boarding in the first place. Robert had his eyes half closed and his hat pulled low, because he had found over the years that this arrangement discouraged conversation more effectively than most other strategies. But she settled into the seat across from him with a small leather traveling bag and a determination about her that cut right through his carefully constructed appearance of sleep. "You are bleeding through your coat," she said. Her voice was direct, not unkind, but with no particular fuss in it either. Robert opened one eye. She was perhaps 26, 27 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned up practically beneath a modest gray hat, and eyes that were an unusual shade of hazel, almost golden in the afternoon light that came through the dusty train window. She was not dressed in the manner of a wealthy woman, but she held herself like someone who had once been told she had no right to hold herself that way and had simply refused to believe it. "I am fine," he said, which was such an obvious lie that he almost felt embarrassed by it. "You are not fine," she replied, in exactly the same tone, setting her bag on the seat beside her and reaching into it with a practicality that surprised him. "I have clean cloth and I have some turpentine, which is not ideal but is considerably better than what you are currently doing, which appears to be nothing." He looked at her more fully then. "You are a nurse." "I am a schoolteacher," she said. "But I grew up on a ranch in Kansas, and my father believed that any person with 2 hands and a working mind should know how to deal with a wound. May I?" He almost told her no. There was a part of him, the part that had been cultivated over 12 years of riding with the kind of men who left burned-out homesteads and terrified families behind them, that said to refuse her, to move away, to protect her from the particular kind of poison that surrounded a man like him. But the wound was bad, and he was tired in a way that went down to the marrow of his bones, and she was already pulling out a length of clean cloth with an air of settled purpose that suggested she was not going to be deterred by stubbornness. "My name is Ruth Merritt," she said, as she leaned forward across the narrow gap between the seats. "And before you lie to me about yours, you should know that I was raised by a man who could spot a lie at 50 paces and thought dishonesty was the single worst quality a human being could possess." "Robert Atkins," he said, and was surprised by how naturally the truth came out of him. She paused just briefly in her work, and he could see the recognition cross her face, faint but unmistakable. She would have heard the name. Most people in Wyoming and Colorado had heard the name, though the stories attached to it varied wildly depending on who was telling them and what they wanted to believe. "All right, Robert Atkins," she said, after a moment, and continued working. "Let me see what we are dealing with." He let her. He sat there in the rattling train car with the Wyoming landscape bleeding into Utah territory beyond the window, and he let a schoolteacher from Kansas tend to a wound that a physician in Cheyenne had told him, with the resigned certainty of a man who had seen many such things, was going to kill him within the week. The bullet had done something internal that could not be fixed with cloth and turpentine, though Ruth Merritt's clean bandaging at least stopped him from bleeding through his coat in a manner that distressed the other passengers. When she was done, she sat back and looked at him with those honest hazel eyes, and he had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing him quite clearly. "The bullet is still in there," she said. "It was not a question." "It is," he agreed, "and you have not sought a doctor." "I sought one. He told me the honest truth, which was that taking it out would kill me faster than leaving it in." He paused. He may have had a point, or he may have simply not wanted the trouble of operating on Robert Atkins. Ruth looked at him steadily. "Where are you going?" "West," he said. "Sacramento. There is a man there I need to see. A man you need to shoot." The bluntness of it startled a short laugh out of him, which pulled at the wound and made him wince. "No," he said when he had recovered. "A man I need to make right with. A man whose family I wronged a good many years ago. I have been carrying that particular debt long enough." She studied him for a long moment, and whatever she found in his face seemed to satisfy some internal question she had been asking. She settled back into her seat and folded her hands in her lap. Outside, the train moved through a long cut in the rock, and the shadow of it passed over them both. "I am going to California as well," she said. "My sister has a house in a town called Fortuna, which is north of Sacramento. She has been asking me to come for 2 years, and I have been making excuses, because Kansas was familiar and comfortable and California seemed like an enormous leap." She paused. "But this past spring my school burned down, and when things burn down it seems like a sign that you ought to stop making excuses." "I am sorry about your school," Robert said. "Thank you. I was very fond of it." She said it plainly, without self-pity, and he found himself admiring that particular quality, the ability to acknowledge a loss without letting it become the whole of who you were. The train moved on through the afternoon, and they sat in a silence that was, surprisingly, not uncomfortable. Robert watched the land outside and thought about James Kellerman, whose family he was going to find in Sacramento. He had been telling himself for 3 years that he would make that trip, and it had taken a bullet in his side from a deputy marshal in Cheyenne to finally force the issue. There was a bitter kind of humor in that, the sort of humor that a man develops when life has been consistently ironic in its arrangements. It was Ruth who broke the silence, about an hour past the Utah border, when the last of the light was turning orange and the shadows of the rock formation stretched long across the ground. "You do not have to tell me anything," she said, "but you look like a man who has been keeping a great deal inside for a very long time, and I have been told I am a reasonable person to talk to." She glanced at him with a slight smile. "Perhaps because I am a stranger and you will likely never see me again after Sacramento." He should have said nothing. He knew that. He had spent 12 years keeping his own counsel, trusting no one with the full truth of who he was and what he had done, because that was simply how a man stayed alive in the kind of life he had been living. But the wound in his side was a constant reminder that staying alive was no longer the primary concern, and there was something about Ruth Merritt, her plainness, her steadiness, the way she had cleaned his wound without flinching and spoken to him without fear or flattery, that made the careful walls he had built feel suddenly less necessary. So he talked. He started with the beginning, which was a small farm in Missouri in the winter of 1864, and a boy of 18 who had watched the war tear through everything his family had built and come out the other side with nothing but a horse and a particular talent for moving fast and taking what he needed. He talked about the first time he had ridden with Cole Drayton's gang, which had started almost by accident and continued, because he had not known how to stop. He talked about the robberies, 12 of them in 6 years, and the way each one had seemed easier than the last until the night of the Kellerman Ranch. Ruth listened without interruption. The train moved through the darkening landscape, and the other passengers around them talked and dozed and rustled with their provisions. And Robert Atkins told the truth to a schoolteacher from Kansas who had cleaned his wound and sat across from him, with the kind of attention that most people reserved for things they genuinely cared about. James Kellerman was not supposed to be there, he said, when he reached that part of the story. Cole said the man was in Denver on business, that the ranch house would have his wife and the foreman, and that was all. It was only horses we were after, good quarter horses that Cole had a buyer for. He stopped, looked out the window at the darkness that had fully settled around them now. But James Kellerman had come home early. He walked into his own stable at 2 in the morning and found 5 men in the middle of stealing his horses, and he reached for his rifle and Cole shot him. The silence between them felt different now, weighted. Cole killed him, Robert said. I did not pull the trigger, but I was there and I could have done something and I did not. I rode out with the others, and I told myself that the man had reached for his weapon, and that these were the rules of the life I was living. But that was a lie I told myself to sleep at night, and it worked less and less well as the years went on. How old was he? Ruth asked quietly. 43. He had a wife and 3 children. The youngest was 7 years old. Robert pressed his hand against his side without thinking, felt the bandage Ruth had applied. I have been sending money to the family through a bank in Denver anonymously for 6 years. It is not enough. It will never be enough, but it is what I could do from a distance. He paused. Now I am going to go and say it to their faces, or as much of it as I can before I run out of time. I think I owe them that much. I think they deserve to have someone look them in the eye and say, without hiding behind anything, this is what happened and I am sorry for it. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the first faint stars were appearing. What about the other men, she asked. The ones who were with you that night? Cole Drayton was hanged in Laramie 2 years ago. 2 of the others are dead, one way or another. The 4th man, Tom Everett, is ranching quietly in New Mexico and has a wife and children of his own. I do not know that dragging him into this would serve any purpose, and I think he has been doing his own version of living with it. And you, Ruth said, what have you been living with? It was such a direct question, asked with such quiet seriousness, that it stopped him completely for a moment. He had not expected the conversation to turn toward him, not this specifically, not this honestly. I have been living with the knowledge that I could have been a different man, he said at last, and chose not to be for a very long time, and that some of the things I chose cannot be undone. He looked at her directly for the first time in a while. That is a harder thing to carry than most people might think. Not because the world punishes you for it, but because you have to look at yourself every morning and account for the distance between what you are and what you could have been. Ruth Merritt looked at him with those golden hazel eyes, and he saw something in them that was not pity and was not judgment, which were the 2 things he had most expected. What he saw was something quieter and more complex, a kind of recognition, as though she understood the particular weight of falling short of your own standards. My father used to say, she said slowly, that a man is not the worst thing he has ever done, that a man is what he does with the time he has after he knows better. She paused. I am not sure I always agreed with him, but I think, sitting here now, I understand what he meant better than I did before. The train stopped at a small station at the Utah-Nevada border for coal and water, and several passengers got off and several new ones got on. A family with 3 young children settled into the seats ahead of them, and the children's noise filled the car with a cheerful, ordinary life that felt both entirely apart from and somehow connected to the conversation that had been happening in the back corner. Robert watched Ruth as she smiled at the smallest child, a boy of perhaps 4 who had turned around in his seat to investigate the passengers behind him with the complete fearlessness of the very young. She had a warm smile, Ruth Merritt, one that changed her whole face, and made the practical reserve she carried loosen into something softer and more openly generous. The child's mother retrieved him and turned him around, but not before Ruth had made him laugh with a face, and the sound of it seemed to do something to Robert that he had not entirely anticipated, a loosening in his chest that was quite different from what the wound was doing to him. "You are good with children," he said. "I am a schoolteacher," she replied with gentle amusement. "It is a professional requirement." But then she said more quietly, "I do love children. I always thought I would have some of my own by now." She said it without self-pity, but with an honesty that matched the honesty she had drawn out of him, as though the conversation they had been having had established a kind of mutual permission for telling the truth. "What stopped you?" he asked, and then immediately said, "Forgive me. That is not my question to ask." "It is all right," she said. "I was engaged 3 years ago to a man who seemed very good and turned out to be considerably less so. He wanted a wife who would stay in the house and agree with everything he said, and when he discovered that I was not that woman, he decided I was unsuitable." She said it with a composure that he suspected had been hard-won. "I stayed at my school and decided I had made a reasonable escape, and mostly I believed that. But sometimes I thought it was a shame that I had to choose between being fully myself and having the things I wanted." Robert thought about that for a while. The train moved through the Nevada desert, and the stars outside were extraordinary, thick and bright in the way they only were when you were far from any town. "What made him decide you were unsuitable?" he asked. Ruth laughed, a genuine laugh, surprised out of her. "I argued with him about politics in front of his business partners," she said, "and I refused to stop teaching after we were married, which he had initially agreed to and then decided he had not meant. And I told a cattle baron who came to our town and tried to drive 2 small farm families off their land that what he was doing was wrong, loudly and in the middle of the main street, which my fiancée found extremely embarrassing." "Were you right?" Robert asked. "About the cattle baron? Of course I was right," she said, with a certainty that made him smile. "He was using a water rights claim that he had purchased through fraudulent means. The families had been on that land for 15 years. Justice is not complicated, most of the time. People simply prefer not to see it clearly because seeing it clearly requires them to do something about it." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about the way she had said that. The injustices of the frontier were not abstractions to people like Ruth Merritt. They were real and immediate things, happening to real people, and she engaged with them as such with a directness that he found both admirable and, if he was honest with himself, deeply appealing. "You would have made a fine lawyer," he said. "I would have," she agreed, "if the law schools had been interested in accepting me, which in 1878 they largely are not." She said it without particular bitterness, just the clear-eyed acknowledgement of the way things were. "So I teach children, which I think is the longer game. If you teach a generation to think clearly and treat people fairly, you change the law eventually." They talked through the night, or rather Robert found that they moved in and out of talk and a comfortable quiet with an ease that surprised him, considering they had been strangers 8 hours ago. Ruth fell asleep somewhere around midnight, her head tipping against the window, and Robert sat with his wound and the stars outside, and the strange lightness that comes when you have said the truth, aloud to someone who heard it without flinching. He thought, in those quiet hours, about the Kellerman family, about the letter he had written and rewritten in a rented room in Cheyenne, trying to explain something that resisted explanation, about the money he had sent, which was not enough and which he had known was not enough, but had been the best approximation of accountability available to a man in his position. He thought also, in a way he had not permitted himself to think in a very long time, about what it might have looked like if his life had gone differently, if he had not ridden with Cole Drayton, if he had found a piece of land somewhere and built something instead of taking things. He was 32 years old and dying of a bullet in his side, and there was a schoolteacher from Kansas asleep across from him, with firelight flickering over her face from the lanterns in the car, and the gap between what he was and what he could have been felt particularly wide and particularly sharp in that moment. He had not expected to feel that particular sharpness. He had made a certain peace, or thought he had, with the trajectory of his life. But Ruth Merritt, in the space of one evening, had reminded him that peace with the past and peace with the present were two entirely different arrangements, and he was only in possession of one of them. Ruth woke at dawn when the train stopped briefly at a small Nevada station, a collection of wooden buildings huddled against the desert in a way that suggested they were not entirely sure they belonged there. She straightened, touched her hair automatically, and then looked across at Robert with a directness that suggested she had moved seamlessly from sleep back to full attention. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Honest answer or polite answer?" "Honest," she said. "The honest answer is that I have felt better," he said, "but I have also felt considerably worse, and I think I can reach Sacramento." "We will be in Sacramento by tomorrow afternoon," she said, with the certainty of someone who had studied the timetable carefully. "Have you made arrangements to find the family when you get there?" The bank in Denver had an address for correspondence. "It is a house on the eastern edge of Sacramento, I believe, or it was 2 years ago." He paused. "I am not entirely sure they will receive me." "No," Ruth said quietly, "they may not. I know that. I think it is important to go regardless." He looked out at the Nevada desert coming alive in the morning light, the grays and tans blooming briefly into something almost warm. "I think there is a difference between making amends for your own peace of mind and making them for the sake of the people you wronged. The second kind requires you to accept that you may get nothing back from it, that the point was never to feel better yourself, but to give them something they are owed." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "You have thought about this a great deal." "I have had a great deal of time to think," he said. A boy of perhaps 10 came through the car selling bread and dried apples from a basket, and Ruth bought some of each and handed half of it to Robert with a practical generosity that seemed entirely characteristic of everything he had seen of her so far. They ate in the early morning quiet of the train, and the desert slid past them, and Robert thought that he could not remember the last time he had simply sat with someone, eaten, watched the light change, and felt the particular warmth of uncomplicated company. "Tell me about your school," he said, "before it burned." Her face changed at that, lit up in a way that made him realize how carefully she had been moderating herself. "It was in a town called Harmon's Creek," she said. 32 students, ages 6 through 14. We had one room and not nearly enough books, but the county had just approved funds for a second set of McGuffey's readers, and I was extremely pleased about that." She paused, smiling at herself. "The older children helped teach the younger ones, which I am not sure was strictly orthodox pedagogy, but which worked extremely well in practice, because teaching something is the best way to truly learn it. And we had a good school board, mostly, except for one man who believed that girls only needed to be taught enough arithmetic to manage a household, which I disputed energetically at every board meeting." Robert listened to her talk about her students, about the girl who had been terrified of mathematics and then discovered she had a gift for it, about the boy who had come from a family that spoke only German and had learned English with a determination that had moved Ruth almost to tears, about the particular pleasure of watching a child's face when understanding arrived. She talked with the ease of someone describing the most important work of their life, which he suspected it was, and he found himself utterly absorbed by it, not just by the content but by the quality of her attention to the children she described, the way she had clearly seen each of them as a complete individual person worthy of full consideration. "Do you have any idea how unusual that is?" he said when she paused. She looked at him with a slight frown. "What do you mean?" "The way you talk about those children. Most people in your position, teaching 32 farm children in a one-room schoolhouse for whatever the county paid you, most people in that position would have been doing a job. You were clearly doing something much more than a job." Ruth was quiet for a moment, and he thought he might have said something wrong, overstepped in some way. But then she said, When I was 8 years old, my teacher, a woman named Mrs. Hapworth, told me that I was the smartest student she had ever taught and that I should fight with everything I had to get as much education as I could, because the world would tell me I didn't need it and the world would be wrong. She paused. She said it once in passing and then went on with the lesson, but I never forgot it. One sentence from one woman at the right moment, and it changed the entire direction of my life. She looked at him. I went into teaching because I believed I might be someone's Mrs. Hapworth. That seemed worth doing. He thought about a boy in Missouri in 1864 and whether there had been someone who might have been his Mrs. Hapworth and what difference it might have made if there had been. He thought about the particular cruelty of a war that stripped away the ordinary structures of a person's life before they were old enough to build the internal ones that might have held them. "I think you almost certainly have been," he said. The Nevada desert gave way gradually to the first hints of California as the day wore on, the landscape changing in small ways that became larger, the vegetation shifting, the light itself taking on a different quality as they approached the Sierra Nevada. The train began the long climb through the mountains in the afternoon, and the air that came through the cracked windows changed, becoming cooler and carrying the clean, almost medicinal smell of pine. The wound was worse in the afternoon. Robert could feel it with a precision that suggested things were progressing in the interior in ways that were not favorable. He kept his face still because he had long practice in keeping his face still, but Ruth noticed anyway. He was beginning to understand, a very sharp pair of eyes, and she used them with a combination of care and directness that made it difficult to maintain pretenses in her presence. "You should rest," she said. "You have been awake all night." "I am fine," he said, knowing she knew the lie. "Robert," she said, and the directness of it, the simplicity of using his name in that tone, stopped him. "Rest, I will be here." He looked at her, and there was something in the way she said it, "I will be here," that he found he had to look away from, because looking at it directly was more than he was currently equipped to manage. He did not know what to do with the particular form of kindness she was offering him, the steady, uncomplicated, generous presence of a person who was simply there, without motive, without performance, without any of the complicated considerations that had characterized every human relationship he had been party to for most of his adult life. He did rest briefly, tipped against the window in the way he had managed it before, and when he woke the train was deep in the mountains, winding through the Sierra Nevada with the sound of the engine laboring against the grade. Ruth was reading a small book she had pulled from her traveling bag, her feet tucked up slightly on the seat, her expression absorbed and quiet. He watched her for a moment before he said anything, and he thought that she was someone who was entirely comfortable being alone, which was not the same as someone who wanted to be alone. She wore her self-possession the way she wore her practical gray clothes, without apology and without self-consciousness, as something that simply was. "What are you reading?" he said. She held it up without looking away from the page for another moment, George Eliot's Middlemarch. "I have read it 4 times, she said. "It gets better each time." "What is it about?" she considered. "It is about people trying to live good lives in a world that makes it difficult," she said. "And about the particular tragedy of intelligence and ambition in women, which the world was not equipped to receive when George Eliot was writing, and which it is still not particularly well equipped to receive now." She glanced at him. "And it is about love, and how people misunderstand it and find it in unexpected places, and sometimes lose it for the most preventable reasons." "You are fond of books," he said. "Books are how I learned that the world was larger than Harmon's Creek, Kansas," she said simply. "When I was 15, my father took me to the lending library in the county seat and let me take out 2 books at a time, and I read everything they had within 3 years. I think books may have saved me, in the way that things save a person when they are young, and the world has not fully made itself available to them yet." Robert thought of the particular absence of that in his own life, of the way he had come of age with the war as context, without the stabilizing presence of someone who believed in the importance of lending libraries and the cultivation of a questioning mind. He did not say this, but he thought Ruth could see it in his face, because she looked at him with a gentleness that acknowledged something without naming it. The train came through the mountains as the sun was setting, the western slopes opening up into the great Central Valley of California, and the view from the window was spectacular in the particular, half-savage way of the western landscape, gold and shadow spreading out below them as the descent began. Several passengers moved to the windows to look, and even the children in the seats ahead fell quiet for a moment, struck by the scale of it. "California," Ruth said softly. "First time?" he asked. "First time." She was watching it with an expression that was half wonder and half something else, something that he recognized as a person in the process of becoming something new, standing at the edge of a change they had been moving toward for a long time. "It is something," he said. "It is," she agreed. "It is very much something." They descended into the valley as the last light failed and the evening came on, warm and different from the high desert, and the train moved through orchards and small farms, and the broad flat immensity of what would become, with water and time, one of the most productive agricultural regions on the continent. Robert felt the journey coming toward its end and felt, alongside the physical deterioration that was proceeding with a steady inevitability, a different kind of reluctance, the reluctance of a man who has found himself unexpectedly in the middle of something he did not know he had been missing. "Ruth," he said, and then stopped. She waited without filling the silence, which was one of the things about her that he had come to appreciate. "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly," he said, "because I have been saying things plainly all night, and I think it would be a wrong turn to stop now." He looked at her. "I have talked to more people in my life than I can count. Outlaws and lawmen and ranchers and merchants and barkeeps and every kind of person you find between Missouri and California, and I can count on the fingers of one hand the conversations that have mattered the way this one has." He paused. "You are a remarkable woman, Ruth Merritt. I mean that without any flattery in it. I mean it as a plain statement of observation." She held very still for a moment, and he could not quite read her expression in the dimness of the car. "Thank you," she said. "That is one of the kindest things anyone has said to me in a long time." She paused. "You are not what I expected Robert Atkins to be." "What did you expect?" She considered this seriously. "Harder," she said at last. "Less present. Men with reputations like yours often seem to be somewhere else when you talk to them, as though they are watching from a distance, waiting for the angle. You are not like that. You are entirely here." She glanced at him. "It makes you easier to talk to than most people I have met." They talked through the dinner hour, and Ruth shared more of the bread she had bought in Nevada, and the family ahead of them settled their children into sleep, and the car grew quieter as the night came fully on. They talked about California and about Kansas, and about the particular character of the frontier, which was, they both agreed, a place of extraordinary freedom and extraordinary injustice running along in parallel, often indistinguishable from each other. They talked about the railroad itself, about what it meant that you could travel from Cheyenne to Sacramento in 2 days when 30 years ago it would have taken months, and what the country might look like in another 30 years when all the blank spaces on the map were filled in. "Do you think there will still be ranches?" Ruth asked. "Or will everything be fences and railroads and towns?" "Both," Robert said. "There is enough land for both. The question is whether there is enough fairness for both. The small ranches and the small farms, the people who came out here with nothing and built something, whether they will be able to hold on when the big money comes for what they have built." He paused. "That is the real fight of this place in this time, I think. Not outlaws and lawmen, the land and who gets to keep it." "You think about these things," she said, with something that was almost wonder. "I have had a lot of time on horseback," he said. "Thinking is the primary available entertainment." She laughed at that, and he laughed too, and for a moment it was simply two people on a train, easy with each other, enjoying the particular pleasure of being genuinely heard. The night deepened. Ruth eventually fell asleep again, and Robert sat with his thoughts and his wound in the darkened car, and he thought about tomorrow, about arriving in Sacramento and finding the Kellerman family, about the words he had been composing for years, whether any words could carry the weight he needed them to carry. And he thought, honest with himself in the way the night and this journey and this particular woman had made him, about the fact that he was dying, and what it felt like to be dying while sitting across from someone who made you wish very strongly that you were not. He had made peace with his death, or thought he had, back in Cheyenne. But peace with death is a different thing before you meet someone who shows you sharply and clearly what life could have been. He did not blame Ruth for this. It was not something she was doing to him. It was simply the nature of truth. It sometimes arrives late, and its lateness is part of what makes it sting. Sacramento in the afternoon of the next day was a city of wood and brick and noise and ambition, the western terminus of the Transcontinental Railroad and the capital of California, sitting at the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers with the confidence of a place that knew it mattered. The train pulled in through the freight yards, and the passenger platform was crowded with people and noise, the organized chaos of arrivals and departures. Robert stood on the platform with his bag and felt the wound with a sharpness that had increased substantially over the past several hours, and knew, with the clarity that sometimes comes at the end of things, that he had perhaps a day or two left in which he would be capable of doing what he had come to do. Ruth stood beside him, her traveling bag in hand, looking at the crowd with the alertness of someone arriving somewhere new and taking inventory. She had not said anything about continuing to her sister's house in Fortuna, had not said goodbye, had simply gotten off the train and stood beside him, and he was not sure what to make of that. "You do not have to come with me," he said. "I know that," she said. "The Kellermans may not receive me well." "I imagine they may not," she agreed. "But I think I would like to see you through this if you will let me." She met his eyes directly. "I think you deserve to have someone with you when you do this. It will be hard enough without doing it entirely alone." He wanted to argue, because some part of him, the old part, said that he did not deserve the company she was offering, that it was not right to let her into the particular difficulty of what was coming. But a larger part of him understood that refusing Ruth Merritt was both futile and wrong, because she was offering something genuine, and refusing genuine things was a habit he was trying to leave behind. "All right," he said. They found the address in the eastern part of Sacramento without much difficulty. It was a modest but well-kept house on a street of similar houses, with a kitchen garden to one side and a horse in the small paddock out back. The afternoon was warm and still, the California autumn entirely different from the sharp cold of Wyoming 2 days before. Robert stood at the gate for a long moment, and Ruth stood beside him and did not rush him. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "you are doing the right thing." He knocked. The woman who answered the door was perhaps 50, with gray threaded through her brown hair and eyes that were sharp with something that was not quite grief and not quite anger but had been made, he thought, out of both of those things over the course of a long time. She looked at him, and he saw recognition move across her face, and he had a moment of wondering how she could know him, and then remembered that wanted posters had circulated for years, and that his face was not unknown in certain parts of the West. "Mrs. Kellerman," he said, "my name is Robert Atkins. I have come to ask your forgiveness and to tell you the truth about what happened to your husband. I will go if you ask me to go, but I hope you will let me speak." The silence stretched long enough that he was certain she was going to close the door. Then she said, "Come in." The interior of the house was plain and clean and smelled of baking bread. There were 2 adult children there, a man of perhaps 28 and a young woman of perhaps 25, who both watched Robert with the wary attention of people who have learned to be careful with strangers. The youngest child, who would have been 7 when James Kellerman was killed, was now 15 and sat in the corner of the room studying Robert with wide eyes. Robert sat across from Alina Kellerman and told the truth. He told it entirely, holding nothing back, the whole of that night in every detail he could remember. He did not offer excuses. He did not diminish his own presence or his own responsibility. He said what he had done and what he had not done and why, and he said that there was no justification for either, and that the money he had sent was something he had felt he owed, and that it did not buy absolution and was not offered in that spirit. Alina Kellerman listened without speaking. Her son's jaw was hard and his hands were closed into fists, but he did not interrupt. Her daughter cried quietly without making a production of it. The 15-year-old watched Robert with the careful attention of someone who was deciding something important. When he was finished, the silence in the room was the loudest kind. Alina Kellerman said, "I know about the money. I always thought it was the man who sent it who had something on his conscience." "Yes," Robert said. "James was a good man," she said. "A good husband, a good father." "I know, I could see that, even in those few moments." He paused. "I am sorry, Mrs. Kellerman." "Those are insufficient words, but they are the true ones." Another silence. Then Alina said, "Why are you here now? Why not a year ago or 5 years ago?" "Because I am dying," Robert said plainly, "and I did not want to leave this world without saying it to your face." Something moved in Alina Kellerman's expression, something that was complicated and human and resistant to simple description. She looked at him for a long time, and then she looked at Ruth, who had sat quietly in the corner through all of it, present but unobtrusive. "Who is she?" Alina asked. "A stranger I met on the train," Robert said, "who was kind enough to come with me." Alina looked at Ruth for another moment, then back at Robert. "I do not forgive you," she said. "I want to be honest about that. What happened to my husband is not something I can forgive today, sitting across from the man who was there and did not stop it. Perhaps in time, perhaps not." She paused. "But I am glad you came. I am glad I know the truth of it. That is something." She looked at her hands. "That is more than nothing." Robert nodded. "That is more than I had a right to expect." He stood to leave, and Alina Kellerman's son, whose name was Daniel, stood too, and Robert prepared himself for what he thought was coming, a confrontation, an expression of the anger that had been visible in the man's face throughout the conversation. But Daniel Kellerman put out his hand, and after a brief, surprised moment, Robert took it. "I do not know what to make of you," Daniel said. "I want to hate you, and I find I cannot, which I may decide later is your fault." He paused. "I am glad you sent the money. I want you to know it helped, particularly the first years after he was gone when we were trying to keep the ranch going. It helped." Robert left the Kellerman house in the late afternoon, walking with Ruth back through the streets of Sacramento, and he felt something he had not expected to feel, not lightness exactly, not relief, but a settling, the sensation of something being placed where it was supposed to be after a long time of being in the wrong location. He had not been forgiven, and he had not sought forgiveness as his primary aim, and the lack of it did not feel like failure. It felt like honesty, which was better. He stopped on a street corner in the afternoon light, and the pain in his side was significant, and Ruth put her hand under his arm with a practical steadiness that held him up without making it about more than it was. "You should sit," she said. "I know." He did not move for a moment. "Ruth, I need to tell you something." "You can tell me while sitting," she said, and guided him to a bench outside a general goods store. He sat, and she sat beside him, and the Sacramento afternoon went on around them with its ordinary business. "I find myself," he said carefully, "in the unexpected position of not wanting to die." She looked at him, very still. "Not because of fear," he said. "I'm not afraid of dying. I have been ready for it for the better part of a year." He looked at his hands. "But I got on a train in Cheyenne thinking I was going to Sacramento to make things right and then be done. And somewhere between Laramie and the Sierra Nevada, I started wanting something I have not wanted in a very long time." He paused. "That is partly your doing, and I want you to know that I am not telling you this to create any obligation or expectation. I am telling you because you asked me last night to say things plainly, and I seem to have contracted the habit." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. The evening light was doing something extraordinary to the Sacramento street around them, turning the dusk golden and the wooden storefronts warm, and somewhere nearby someone was playing a fiddle. "The doctor in Cheyenne," she said. "Was he qualified?" "He was adequate," Robert said. "He told me the bullet could not be removed without killing me faster." "He told you that in Cheyenne," Ruth said. "We are in Sacramento. There is a physician here named Dr. Horace Webb who studied at the Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia and who has a practice on K Street and who has been doing surgeries in this city for 12 years. She met his eyes directly. "I know this because my sister's letter mentioned him specifically, because she had a difficult pregnancy last spring and he was the doctor who saw her through it." She paused. "Cheyenne in 1878 is not the same as Sacramento in 1878, Robert. The medical care available to you is not the same." He stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Because I read, and I pay attention, and because I am the kind of person who memorizes the relevant details in letters from her sister in case they turn out to be important." She said it with a slight, controlled urgency that was as close to fear as he had seen from her. "I am not telling you he will certainly succeed. I am telling you that the opinion of one doctor in Cheyenne is not the last word, and that before you decide to die, you might consider whether you have asked every available question." They went to see Dr. Horace Webb that evening, and Dr. Webb, who was a thin, precise man with spectacles and the focused manner of someone who believed very strongly in what he was doing, examined Robert's wound with a thoroughness that took the better part of an hour, and involved several instruments that Robert preferred not to examine too closely. He straightened and looked at Robert with the directness of a man who delivered honest assessments as a professional obligation. "The bullet nicked the lower edge of your liver," he said. "The Cheyenne doctor was not wrong that the position made it dangerous to remove. However, the infection that has developed is the more immediate threat, and that I can treat aggressively. As for the bullet, I have done 2 similar extractions in the past year, and both patients survived, though I will not pretend there is no significant risk." He paused. "My honest assessment is that without intervention, you have perhaps 3 days. With intervention, the odds are better than you might expect, perhaps 6 in 10 in your favor." Robert looked at Ruth, who was standing by the window with her hands clasped, watching him with an expression that was careful and controlled, and he understood that she was not going to say what she wanted to say because this was his decision, and she was the kind of woman who respected that, even when it cost her. "All right," he said to Dr. Webb. "Do what you can." The surgery took 3 hours, and Ruth sat in Dr. Webb's waiting room through all of it, which was not the most comfortable room he had apparently ever furnished. She had purchased a newspaper from a boy on the street and read it without taking in a great deal of its content, and she drank the tea that Dr. Webb's housekeeper brought her, and she prayed, which was something she did not do as routinely as perhaps she should, but which seemed entirely appropriate under the circumstances. Dr. Webb came out at 9:30 in the evening and told her that the bullet had been removed and that the patient was alive, and that the next 24 hours would determine a great deal. Robert was alive at the end of the next 24 hours, and alive the day after that, and by the end of the 3rd day Dr. Webb came into the room where his patient lay, pale and exhausted, but with a clarity in his eyes that had not been there before, and said that the infection was responding to treatment, and that he believed, cautiously, that the man was going to recover. Ruth had arranged a room at a respectable boarding house 2 streets over, and she visited every morning and every afternoon and some evenings, bringing food and books and the steady, practical presence of herself, which Robert found was the most effective medicine available. He recovered slowly, because bodies that have been damaged significantly do not rush the process, but he recovered with a consistency that Dr. Webb described as remarkable, though those who knew Robert Atkins might not have found it entirely surprising that he approached survival with the same determined persistence he had brought to everything else. In those days of recovery, They talked more. Ruth brought Middlemark and read passages aloud, and Robert listened and occasionally argued, and she argued back with a pleasure that was entirely undisguised, and they found between them an understanding that had the particular quality of something that has been confirmed by time and test, rather than simply assumed. On the fifth day, when Robert was sitting up and the color had come back into his face, Ruth came in the morning with a letter in her hand. She sat down and held it for a moment without speaking, which was unusual enough for her that he gave her his full attention. "It is from my sister," she said. "She is wondering when I am arriving." She paused. "I told her in my last letter that I had been delayed. I did not specify why." "Fortuna is north of here," Robert said. "A few days' travel." "Yes." She looked at the letter. "She has a house with a spare room and a school in the town that has been looking for a teacher." A pause. "She has been very eager for me to come." "You should go," he said. She looked up at him with those direct hazel eyes. "I know I should," she said. "And I will." She hesitated, which was so uncharacteristic that he felt the weight of it clearly. "Robert, I have been sitting in this town for almost 2 weeks, and I have thought about a great many things, and I want to say one of them to you, because you taught me on a train between Laramie and Sacramento that saying true things directly is better than holding them, and I have taken that lesson seriously." He waited. "I would like to see you again," she said. "Not merely as someone who was kind on a train and sat with you through a difficult thing. I mean, I would like to see you as someone who is interested in knowing who you become now that you have the opportunity to become something." She held his gaze without wavering. "I think you are a man worth knowing, Robert Atkins. Not the outlaw, not the story that people have attached to your name, but the man who talked all night on a train about justice and children and the gap between what you are and what you could be. That man is worth knowing." She paused. "I thought you should be aware of that." He looked at her for a long time. Outside the window, Sacramento went about its morning in the California autumn, and somewhere a bell rang, and the ordinary life of the place continued in its ordinary way. "I am going to get well," he said. "And when I am well, I am going to need to decide what a man does with the rest of his life when the life he has been living is over." He paused. "I think I would like to make that decision in a direction that leads somewhere close to Fortuna, California, if you have no strong objection." Ruth Merritt looked at him, and the smile that crossed her face was the fullest, most open smile he had seen from her, warmer and wider than the smile she had given the child on the train, which was saying something. "I have no objection whatsoever," she said. She left for Fortuna 4 days later, when Robert was well enough that Dr. Webb agreed the immediate crisis had passed, and that the remaining recovery, which would take several more weeks, could proceed without constant supervision. She left him with a note that contained her sister's address and very clear instructions about following Dr. Webb's orders, both of which she delivered with the manner of a schoolteacher, accustomed to making sure her instructions were received and understood. He watched her leave from the window of his room at the boarding house and felt the absence of her as something physical, which was not an experience he had before, and which he chose to regard as information rather than sentiment, though the distinction was perhaps artificial. He spent 6 more weeks in Sacramento, recovering under Dr. Webb's care and beginning the process of making himself into whatever came next. He was not sure, in those early weeks, what next looked like. He had no trade beyond his horse and his gun, neither of which seemed like appropriate foundations for a new life, and he had spent 12 years outside the legitimate structures of commerce and work in ways that did not recommend him as an applicant for most available positions. But he had money, more than most people knew, accumulated over years, and invested carefully through a lawyer in Kansas City who had asked no awkward questions, and he had time now to think about what to do with it. He sat in Dr. Webb's waiting room while waiting for appointments and talked to the patients around him, farmers and merchants and craftsmen and laborers, all of them trying to build something in a territory that was still in the process of becoming itself, and he found, gradually and then with increasing clarity, the shape of what he wanted to do. He wrote to Ruth while he was recovering. The first letter was short and careful, a report on his health and a brief account of a conversation he had had with a Sacramento land agent about available acreage in the northern part of the valley. Her reply arrived 8 days later, 5 full pages in a clear, decisive handwriting, which told him about the school in Fortuna where she had begun teaching and about the town itself, which she was finding to her liking, and which ended with a single sentence about being glad he was recovering well that managed to carry considerably more warmth than its measured construction suggested. He wrote back 10 pages. She replied with 12. The correspondence developed its own character, direct and honest and occasionally sharp. Two people who had found they could say true things to each other and were discovering, with each letter, how many true things there were to say. He arrived in Fortuna on a Wednesday in December of 1878, 6 weeks after Ruth had left Sacramento, and nearly 3 months after he had boarded a train in Cheyenne that he had expected to be his last journey. The town was small and prosperous, nestled among the redwoods of the Eel River Valley, and the air had a clean, enormous quality unlike anywhere else he had been. Ruth's sister, Clara, had a house on the edge of town with a wide porch and a kitchen garden, and a husband named Thomas who shook Robert's hand with a wariness that was entirely legitimate, and then watched him through dinner with the attention of a man making up his mind about something. Ruth herself opened the door when he knocked, and he had a moment of simply looking at her, noting that she was unchanged and also entirely different from the image of her he had been carrying for 6 weeks, because the image was always insufficient when the person was actually standing in front of you. "You look considerably better than the last time I saw you," she said. "I feel considerably better," he agreed. "Come in," she said. "Clara has made dinner, and Thomas is curious about you, which he is managing with only moderate success." He came in, and the evening was warm and a little complicated, because Thomas was a protective man and Clara was a perceptive one, and both of them could see clearly what was happening between their guest and their sister, and neither was entirely sure what to make of Robert Atkins, which was fair. But the dinner was good, and the conversation was honest, and Robert told Thomas directly that he had a particular history that Thomas was welcome to investigate, and that he had no intention of hiding or minimizing it, which seemed to satisfy the man's requirements for basic honesty, even if it did not fully resolve his reservations. After dinner, Ruth and Robert walked along the edge of the town in the December evening, the enormous redwoods visible against the sky, and the quiet of the place was a specific kind of quiet that you only found in certain parts of the world, heavy and clean and very old. "I found some land," Robert said, "about 12 miles north of here, up in the valley. 160 acres with a creek and a stand of timber, and a small house that needs a great deal of work but is structurally sound." He paused. "I am going to buy it." Ruth walked beside him in the way she had on the Sacramento street, present and steady, and said, "What are you going to do with it?" "Ranch it initially," he said. "I know horses and I know cattle and I have the capital to start modestly and build from there. And I want to do something with the timber, managed carefully in a way that does not destroy the land." He paused. "And in time, if things go the way I hope they go, I want to build a better house on it." He looked at her directly. "I want to be honest with you about what I am saying, Ruth, so there is no ambiguity. I came to Fortuna because the land north of here suited my requirements, and also because you are here, and those two facts are not unconnected." She stopped walking and turned to face him in the December dusk, the redwoods enormous and indifferent above them, the lights of the town visible through the trees. "I know," she said. "I have been aware of the not unconnected nature of the situation." She looked at him with the directness that he had come to understand was simply who she was, unwavering and honest and entirely characteristic. "I am glad you came. I want you to know that clearly." "Then I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it properly, not in passing. I have not had much practice with properly, so you will have to forgive any roughness in the execution." Ruth's expression was very still and very warm and entirely attentive. "I want to know you better," he said. "I want to do that in the way that a man does when he intends something serious and long-term, which means calling on you formally and meeting your obligations honestly and doing whatever you require to demonstrate that my intentions are what I say they are." He paused. "I am not going to pretend that what I was is irrelevant. I know it is not. I know you know it is not. But I am asking whether what I am becoming is something you want to be part of." She looked at him for a long, full moment, and then she said, "Yes, Robert Atkins. What you are becoming is something I very much want to be part of." He called on her formally through the winter, which was the appropriate arrangement, and which Ruth's sister Clara enforced with a thoroughness that suggested she had decided Robert was acceptable, but was not going to be casual about it. He bought the land north of town in January, and he began the work of building it into something, repairing the house and fencing the pasture, and acquiring the first horses with the particular knowledge of a man who had spent 12 years appreciating good horseflesh from a perspective he was now modifying into something more legitimate. He and Ruth walked together on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, and they wrote letters when they could not be together. And the correspondence continued with the same character it had had in Sacramento, honest and direct, and occasionally funny and increasingly intimate, in the way of people who have discovered that talking to a particular person is the thing they most want to be doing, and are spending as much time as available doing it. Ruth's school was thriving, which did not surprise Robert in the least. She had the students presenting their own lessons to each other within the first month, and had lobbied the school board for additional library books within the first 2, and had told the one board member who suggested girls did not need advanced arithmetic what she thought of that opinion with a clarity that had apparently left the man in a mild state of shock for several days afterward. Robert listened to her talk about her students with the same pleasure he had felt on the train, watching the way the work of it genuinely lit her. And he thought about the particular luck of being in the presence of someone who knew what they were meant to do and did it fully and without reserve. In March, on a Sunday afternoon, with the first of the California spring arriving in the form of wildflowers along the creek on his land, Robert Atkins asked Ruth Merritt to marry him. He did it sitting on the fence at the edge of his pasture, with the horses behind him and the redwoods across the valley, and Ruth beside him with her coat wrapped around her against the March coolness. And he did it with the same plainness that had characterized everything between them. He said he loved her. He said it was a surprising thing to him, not that he was capable of it, because he had always suspected in some private part of himself that he was, but that it had arrived so clearly and so completely and been so entirely specific to her. He said that he knew he was asking her to attach herself to a history that was complicated, and that he would understand if she decided the complication was too much. Ruth listened to all of it, as she always did, with complete attention. Then she said, "Robert, I knew on a train outside Laramie that you were someone worth knowing. I have spent the better part of a year confirming it in every detail I could find." She took his hand in hers, which she had never done before, and held it firmly. "Yes, I will marry you. I would like very much to marry you." They were married in April of 1879, in the small church in Fortuna, with Clara and Thomas standing as witnesses and several of Ruth's students in attendance, because she had not had the heart to leave them out, and they had been enormously invested in the whole affair since they had discovered their teacher was being courted by a man who had a ranch and horses and who visited every Sunday. It was a modest ceremony, because neither of them was inclined toward ceremony for its own sake, but it was earnest in the way that matters, said with the full weight of 2 people who had thought carefully about what they were doing and meant every word of it. Robert wore a new suit that he had purchased in Eureka, which was the largest nearby town, and Ruth wore a dress of deep blue that Clara had helped her make. And when she walked up the aisle of that small church, Robert watched her come toward him and felt something settle in him that had been restless for 32 years. After the wedding, they went to the ranch north of town, which Ruth had spent the previous 2 months making into a home with the same thorough practicality she brought to everything, and they began their life together in the California spring of 1879. The ranch grew steadily through that first year. Robert had a genuine talent for the work, which was both more legitimate and more satisfying than the work he had done before, and he approached the business of building a ranch the way he had once approached everything, with full attention and without half measures. He traded horses in the summer, carefully bred and well-trained animals that built a reputation in the Northern Valley within the year. He began a small timber operation on the eastern edge of the property, managed as he had promised, in a way that took the wood without destroying the forest. Ruth continued teaching through the fall, and in the winter she told him, with a composure that did not entirely conceal her own excitement, that they were going to have a child. She said it plainly, across the kitchen table one evening in November, and Robert put down his coffee and looked at her and felt something that he did not have adequate language for, though he thought it was the particular form of happiness that arrives when the future begins to take a specific and visible shape. Their son was born in July of 1880, a sturdy and emphatically vocal boy with Robert's dark hair and Ruth's golden eyes, who arrived in the world with what Dr. Webb, who had traveled up from Sacramento because Ruth had requested him specifically, described as a most determined attitude. They named him James, which was Robert's idea and which Ruth understood without having to explain it to her, because she knew exactly who he was named for and why, and she agreed without hesitation. James Kellerman, the original bearer of the name, had died in a way that could not be undone, and the debt that had been part of what Robert Atkins was could not be simply erased. But it could be carried forward differently, in the form of a child who bore the name not as a burden, but as a kind of continuing acknowledgement, a way of saying that the past was not forgotten even as the present was being built on better foundations. Robert wrote to Eleanor Kellerman when the boy was born, a short letter that explained the name and offered no justification for it, simply a statement of what it meant to him and why. Eleanor wrote back, 2 months later, with a brevity that nevertheless carried something that he could recognize, something that was not forgiveness and not absolution, but was perhaps the closest human approximation of both that the situation was ever likely to produce. She said that her youngest child, now 16, was doing well in school and had ambitions to study engineering. She said that Daniel had expanded the ranch and was doing good work. She said, at the end of the letter, that life goes on, which was the kind of true thing that is only worth saying when you have earned the right to it. Ruth went back to teaching in the autumn after James was born, bringing the baby to school in his first months with the help of a woman from town named Mrs. Hargrove, who had retired from teaching herself and was delighted to spend her days in a schoolroom again. The school board had objections, which Ruth addressed at a school board meeting with a thoroughness that left the board in general agreement with her position and slightly unsure how they had arrived there, which was characteristic. The years on the ranch were good years. They were not without difficulty, because no years of real life are without difficulty, and the frontier had its challenges, years of drought and years when the cattle prices fell, and the particular ongoing struggle of small landowners trying to hold their ground against the consolidating pressures that Ruth had predicted, and that continued to bear down on the Northern California Valley as the railroad brought larger capital and larger ambitions. Robert found himself, on more than one occasion, standing alongside his neighbors in disputes with land agents and water rights claimants, using the same clear-eyed reading of injustice that Ruth had always brought to such things, and bringing to it additionally the particular knowledge of a man who had once been on the other side of those dynamics and knew precisely how they operated. He was respected in the valley, not because people did not know his history, because they did. And in a small community, histories are not easily hidden, but because what he was and what he did in the valley was visible and consistent and honest. And the frontier had always been, at its best, a place that understood the difference between what a man had been and what a man was. Their daughter was born in 1882, 2 years after James, on a September evening with the stars out over the valley and the sound of the creek audible through the open window of the bedroom. They named her Clara, after Ruth's sister, who had been enthusiastically helpful during the pregnancy and was present for the birth, which she described afterward as the finest experience she had had since her own children were born, which Thomas confirmed with the slightly exhausted agreement of a man who understood that enthusiasm is not always evenly distributed in these matters. Clara was different from James in every way that children can be different, which is many. Where James was sturdy and persistent and direct, Clara was quick and subtle, and found the humor in things with a readiness that seemed to have arrived fully formed. She had Robert's ease of movement and Ruth's sharpness of mind, and she could be found at the age of 3 sitting in the corner of Ruth's schoolroom with a book, absorbing the general atmosphere of learning with an equanimity that suggested she found this perfectly natural. Robert watched his daughter one afternoon in the schoolroom, 3 years old, with a book she could not yet read held deliberately in her lap, and felt the particular completeness that comes when you understand you have built something that will outlast you, not in the grim way of his earlier certainties about mortality, but in the warm and ordinary and extraordinary way of a life lived forward. The ranch produced a third child in 1885, another boy they named William, who arrived in the spring and spent the first years of his life following his father and his older brother around the property, with a wholehearted devotion that both of them found entirely charming. William had Ruth's auburn hair and an aptitude for horses that became apparent so early that Robert began quietly setting aside one of the best mares for the boy before he could properly walk, which Ruth described as excessive, and in which she clearly took considerable pleasure. Ruth's teaching continued to evolve as the years passed. She had, by 1885, convinced the school board to expand the school to 2 rooms and hire a second teacher, a young woman named Miss Aldrich, who had come out from Ohio with a teaching certificate and a determination to do good work in the West. Ruth mentored her with the particular combination of high expectation and genuine warmth that characterized everything she did, and Miss Aldrich later described those years with Ruth Merritt as the most important education of her professional life. The library in Fortuna was, in no small measure, Ruth's doing, the result of 3 years of letters to the State Education Board, 2 petitions to the town council, and 1 extraordinarily effective public speech at the town meeting of 1884 that resulted in an allocation of funds that had not previously seemed available. The library opened in the summer of 1885 with 400 books, which Ruth considered a beginning, and the town council considered an achievement, and which the children of Fortuna and the surrounding valley used with an enthusiasm that vindicated every argument Ruth had made for it. Robert attended the opening of the library on a Saturday morning in June, standing in the back of the small building while Ruth spoke to the assembled townspeople with the clear and earnest pleasure of someone doing exactly what she had set out to do. He watched her and thought about a train in Wyoming, 7 years before, and the woman across the car who had told him he was bleeding through his coat with such uncomplicated directness that he had trusted her immediately and entirely. He thought about James Kellerman and about Eleanor Kellerman's letter, which he still had in a box in his study alongside the other things he kept. He thought about the conversation he and Ruth had had on that train, all those hours, all that truth exchanged between strangers in the particular freedom of a moving train that neither of them had found elsewhere. And he thought that whatever else was true about the arc of his life, that conversation had been the turning point of it. After the library dedication, Ruth found him in the crowd and took his arm in the easy, habitual way of people who have been together long enough that the gesture requires no thought, and they walked home in the summer afternoon, back to the ranch where James and Clara and William were in the care of Mrs. Hargrove, who was now in her late 60s and had announced her intention to watch after the Atkins children until she was no longer physically able, which she said would be some considerable time yet. "Well," Ruth said as they walked through the town. "You were extraordinary," he said. "I was adequate," she replied in the tone that meant she was pleased. "You were extraordinary," he repeated, "and I am not going to let you revise that downward." She laughed, and he felt it, that laugh, as he had always felt it, as the specific sound of a particular happiness. They came home to the ranch in the long June evening and ate dinner with their children and Mrs. Hargrove and talked about the library and the summer and the horses and whether William's aptitude for them was a sign of a calling or simply the enthusiasm of a 4-year-old for large animals, a question on which Robert and Ruth held opposite positions and which they debated with the cheerful seriousness of two people who genuinely enjoyed disagreeing with each other. After the children were in bed, they sat on the porch in the warm night, the sound of the creek in the darkness and the enormous shapes of the redwoods against the stars, which were as thick and bright in the Fortuna sky as they had been over the Nevada desert on the night of the train. "I have been thinking," Ruth said, "about going back to Sacramento." He looked at her. "For what purpose?" "I had a letter last month from Alina Kellerman's daughter, the younger one, who is studying to be a teacher. She wants advice on teacher training programs, and she mentioned that her family has moved to Sacramento proper." She paused. "I thought it might be appropriate for us to visit, as a family." She looked at him carefully. "Not because we owe it to anyone, and not because there is any unfinished business, but because I think there is something valuable in that connection being real, not just a letter, not just money, but people knowing people." Robert was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark valley and the stars. "I think you are right," he said. "I usually am," she said, which was not entirely true and which both of them knew and neither of them said, because some things are better left as comfortable fictions between people who love each other. They went to Sacramento in the fall of 1885, all 5 of them, a family on a train headed west from Fortuna to the capital, and the children were enormous fascinated by the journey. James at 5 already full of questions about the railroad and the engine and how fast they were going. Clara at 3 maintaining a dignified interest in everything. William at 4 months sleeping through the entire journey with a thoroughness that Ruth considered his finest quality. The meeting with the Kellermans was quiet and real and complicated in the ways that complicated things are when people approach them honestly, which is to say that it was not comfortable exactly, but it was genuine, and genuine things have a value that comfort cannot replicate. Alina Kellerman was 60 now, and her children were grown, and the afternoon they spent together in a Sacramento parlor was marked by the kind of careful honesty that people practice when they have decided not to pretend that hard things are simple. Alina Kellerman looked at James, who was sitting on the floor examining a small wooden horse he had found, and said nothing for a moment, and then looked at Robert with an expression that he could not fully read and that he thought she might not have been able to fully explain either. "He looks like a good boy," she said. "He is," Robert said. "He is very much his mother's son." "He is named for my husband," Alina said. "Yes," Robert said simply. The afternoon ended with a quiet that was not peace exactly, but was something in that direction, an understanding between people who have been through something irrevocable together and have chosen to carry it forward as humans rather than as symbols of it. Alina Kellerman's daughter, the aspiring teacher, talked with Ruth for an hour about pedagogy and curriculum and the particular challenges of teaching in California. And when they left, the girl shook Robert's hand and said she hoped they would write, and that she was glad he had come to Sacramento all those years ago. On the train back to Fortuna, With the children asleep and the California evening spreading its gold over the valley outside the window, Ruth leaned against Robert's shoulder in a way that required no explanation and no words. "Good," he said after a while. "Very good," she agreed. He thought about a dying outlaw on a train headed west, bleeding through his coat, and a schoolteacher who sat across from him and told him plainly that she could see what was happening and was not going to pretend otherwise. He thought about the particular grace of truth told at the right moment to the right person, and how that grace can change the entire trajectory of a life. He thought about Dr. Horace Webb in Sacramento and Mrs. Hapworth in Kansas, and the way that single people at single moments can alter everything, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the simple application of their full and generous attention. He thought about James Kellerman, and about the boy on the floor this afternoon playing with a wooden horse, who carried that name forward into a future that James Kellerman himself had not been permitted to see. He thought about the ways we carry the people we have wronged, and the people we have loved, and the people who have changed us, not as weights exactly, but as presences, as ongoing conversations that continue even after the words have stopped. Ruth's hand found his in the darkening train car, the same easy, habitual gesture, and he held it with the same ease, the particular ease of two people who have found each other at a turning point and chosen, both of them, to turn toward each other. Their children slept in the seats around them, James with his hat over his face in unconscious imitation of his father on a different train 7 years ago, Clara tucked neatly with her small hands folded, William in his basket with the complete and trusting abandon of infancy. The train moved through the California evening, heading north, heading home. The ranch was waiting, with its horses and its timber and its kitchen garden and its view of the redwoods in the morning light. Ruth's school was waiting, and the library she had built, and the students who would come in September with their new boots and their hesitant faces and their enormous, unlimited potential. The letters from Alina Kellerman would continue, occasionally, carefully, honestly, because honest things require maintenance, and Robert Atkins had spent too many years avoiding honest things to return to that habit now. He was 40 years old and healthy, and in the specific possession of a life that he had not expected and had not deserved, and had accepted with both hands when a schoolteacher on a train outside Laramie had looked at him with those hazel eyes and told him without fuss, without performance, simply and directly, that she could see what was happening, and she intended to do something about it. That was, he thought, the truest thing about love, the thing that none of the songs and none of the stories got quite right. It was not a grand gesture or a dramatic declaration. It was a woman who saw you bleeding through your coat and said so, and cleaned the wound, and sat with you through the long night of your confessions, and stayed. It was the steadiness of someone who had decided that you were worth the full application of their attention, and who gave that attention without reservation and without keeping score. Ruth shifted slightly beside him, still half asleep, and he felt the warm weight of her against his side, and thought about the bullet that had been in that side on a train very much like this one, in the autumn of 1878, and the woman who had come into his life because of it, and the specific impossibility of regretting the wound that had brought her there. Outside, the California evening became the California night, and the stars came out over the great valley, thick and brilliant and very old, and the train moved north through the darkness toward the redwoods and the Eel River Valley, and the life that two people had built together from the wreckage of a life. One of them had already been living, and the particular beauty of that, of building something real and good out of what had seemed like an end, was as clear as anything Robert Atkins had ever seen. He pressed his lips to Ruth's hair, brief and quiet, and she made a small sound without waking, and the children slept, and the train carried them all forward into whatever was coming, which was, for the first time in a very long time, something worth going toward. The land north of Fortuna was still and silvery in the early morning when they arrived home the next day. the redwoods draped in the coastal mist that burned off each day as the sun climbed, and the horses came to the fence as they always did, because horses know when the people who care for them are returning. William woke and held his arms out with the authority of a baby who knows exactly what he wants, and Robert took him and carried him through the gate of his own land, past the horses and the kitchen garden and the timber beyond, and the boy looked at all of it with his bright eyes and grabbed Robert's collar and held on, which seemed, as endings go, both entirely sufficient and entirely true. James ran ahead to find Mrs. Hargrove and tell her everything about Sacramento with a 5-year-old's comprehensive and only slightly accurate account of events. Clara walked beside her mother with the careful consideration of a girl who was already deciding what she thought about the world and was taking her time about it. Ruth came through the gate last, pausing to close it behind her, and looked up at the house and the land and the mountains beyond, and then looked at Robert with William in his arms, and her expression was the one he had come to know best over 7 years of mornings and evenings and ordinary days and difficult ones, the expression of a woman entirely present in the life she had chosen. He thought of the train. He thought of her first words to him. He thought of all the true things they had told each other since. "Home," he said. "Home," she agreed, and walked toward him across the yard of their own land in the morning light of California with everything ahead of them,